I'm in the spare room today. I'm looking for somewhere a little bit quieter to record. This chapter was quite long. It did clear up several points from the last chapter though. The guests, for instance, it was all about the meal and after the meal. So it's just this single evening, about 4 or 5 hours maybe. They ate and they drank. This seems to be the point of this chapter. There was a lot of alcohol, a lot more drinking than Edward is used to, and he was trying very hard to not drink. They were sort of pushing the drinks on him anytime they saw that he had an empty glass, so were making sure to fill it up. But as the evening went on, he seems to have had an easier time. Rose left the table at the end of the meal, which is what women did, and when it was just the men, the drinking continued. We got to know the guests a little bit better, and Bradwardine himself. Of the 3 guests, the third one, Duncan McWeeble, was what Bradwardine called his Baron Bailey. So I gather he is like his agent, manager, property manager type person. So he's an employee, but he's not a servant, which means that he's of rank enough to sit at the table and eat with them. But he is still, because he is an employee, he's not a full equal, and he's fairly retiring at the table. He participates in everything, but he never really forgets his position. So the other 2 guests were, and I have a lot of trouble with this because I've got several names. They are Scottish names. Oh dear. As well as working full-time, I do on-call in the evenings, which means sometimes, just while I'm settled down doing something else, the phone will ring and I have to go off for an hour or 2. And then when I come back, I can't quite remember what I was talking about. And that's sort of where I'm at now. But I think I was talking about the names. There were the 3 people, and they're all lairds, lords, whatever, who are the Baron of Bradwardine. That's the man that Edward went to visit, and the 2 other guests, who was the Laird of Balmawhapple and the Laird of Killancurate, however you pronounce it. And the thing is, the Laird of Balmawhapple is sometimes called Balmawhapple because that's the place he comes from. So Balmawhapple, the man, his name is actually Mr. Falconer, and he is a young man and he is into sport. The other man is the Lord of Killancurate, who is sometimes called Killancurate. He is an older man and he is Mr. Bullsegg. Now Mr. Bullsegg, as it said in the last chapter, but it was in the middle of all that dialogue, Mr. Bullsegg, his grandfather was a commoner who married the widow of a lord, and although by this marriage he didn't actually become the lord, she remained the lady, their joint child was the next heir. So that meant the surname Bullsegg, which is a commoner surname, has now perpetuated in that line. That's the main surname. And Bullsegg, he has a strong interest in agricultural matters, apparently because of his commoner background. So there's those 2, and then there's the Baron of Bradwardine, who is also named Tully Veolan because he's the Baron of Tully Veolan. So they've each got their own name. They've got their surname, they've got their estate name, and then by the end of this chapter, those names have become abbreviated so that the Baron of Bradwardine, who lives at Tully Veolan, he's just being called Tully. And the Laird of Killancurate, who is otherwise known as Mr. Bullsegg, he's being called Killy. And Balmawhapple, aka Mr. Falconer, is Bally. I had a little bit of trouble remembering all that. I've got it now, obviously, because I've just said it all. So this chapter was the meal where they just got to know each other. They ate, they drank, Rose vanished from the table, they drank some more. Tully got his servant to bring him this ceremonial bear cup and some very special brandy, and he filled it up and the cup went round the table and they all drank of this cup, which was entirely in honour of Edward, whose heart quailed when he saw it because he just felt there'd already been enough wine and he was trying not to drink too much, but he couldn't do anything about this. It was clearly in his honour, he had to drink, so he drank a fair bit of this brandy. And after that, the meal came to an end and they all went for a walk to see the 3 guests out. So they went to the gate, up the long avenue to the outer gate and into the village, which apparently was where those 3 had actually left their horses. Now, when Edward rode through there before, all he saw was huts, very, very hovel-like huts. But apparently it is a proper village and it's got an inn. It's not exactly an inn. It's like a dwelling place that has an inn and has some stables that's run by a woman called, and let me find her name, Lucky McCleary. So they went back here and then there's more drinking. There's a whole lot of stuff about customs. Apparently you can have what's called like a parting drink, a standing drink at the door, that by Scottish custom that one is free. So there's like a whole lot about that. And then in the notes there's some little story of some cow that drank alcohol that was at the door, and I don't know. The gist is though that they've had a huge night of drinking. Edward has managed to stay a little bit more sober than the others, but when they're in this place, they're half sloshed. Tully and Bally sing songs. They're sort of drowning each other out. It's not really very amicable. Everybody's sort of sinking into their own little reveries, and Tully sings a song that's French, but the others aren't really into that, so Bally just kind of drowns him out with a rousing drinking song. And it all goes fairly well until Bally makes a political statement. He does this because, you know, they're all Jacobites. This is their normal process. But Tully, even though he's been drinking, is very aware that Edward is there. He doesn't actually know what Edward's political bent is, but he does know that Edward is a soldier in a Hanoverian army and that Edward is obliged to serve King George. So Edward cannot actually sit back and hear this kind of treasonous talk. By law, he can't just sit back and take it. And Tully is very aware of this. So he's saying to his friend, no, you can't do this. Stop talking like that. Mind your tongue. And Bally, because they've all had a bit to drink, it all gets pretty heated and they pull out the rapiers and they have this sort of a rapier fight, but they're all pretty drunk. So who knows how it's going to turn out, but Lucky McCleary runs in and she's wearing plaid, you know, like Scottish tartan plaid. She tosses her plaid over the blades and brings it all to a halt, and the men's own servants come in and pull them apart. At which point the visitors go off home and we're just left with Tully and Edward and Tully's main servant, who is Alexander Saunders. And I forgot to mention his name before, but he was the butler. His name is Alexander Saunders, and he had actually accompanied them, probably leading the horse, when they went into the village. So Alexander and Edward both sort of helped Tully back because he's had quite a bit to drink. And that's the end of the chapter. So the point of this chapter, as far as I can see, is to introduce these other characters. And I don't know, given that 3 of them were visitors, that was Bally, Killy and Duncan McWeevil, I don't know if they're going to turn out to be long-standing characters or not. This is something, because this book is kind of an early fiction one and they hadn't really honed the craft very well, it's hard to tell. It's just so much to hold in my head because I don't know which characters are going to persist in this story and which are not. The gist of this chapter, as I can see it, is just that Edward has entered a very strange world. It's all the heavy drinking is a shock to him. On the whole, he is understanding what they say. They're using a few words that he doesn't know here and there, but it's comprehensible, and he is the guest of honour. Tully is extremely happy to have him there. But beyond this, I can see that Scott is showing us how the Highlanders live. It's almost anthropological though. It's very much these are the Highlanders and these are their customs and this is how they behave in this situation. I know that was the objective and he's doing that quite well, but it's not a story. And I can see that by doing this, he's feeling his way through who the audience is, what his purpose in writing the book is. He wants, in the back of his head, I'd say he wants to write this story, but he doesn't think that's what's going to sell the book. He thinks that it's all this stuff about the Highland manners and the Highland characters that's actually going to be of interest to his readers. So what he's doing is kind of marrying what he thinks everybody else wants with what he actually wants to do himself. And we just see these little flashes here and there of his own interest, his own enthusiasm in the work. But because we don't really have a story yet, it's hard to know as a reader what to hang on to. At this point, it's not as if we're looking to see what the result of anything is. There is nothing to have a result. So while there was a little bit of action here, and it was kind of interesting, it's all a bit comedic, I think, with the drinking and the drunken sword fight and the songs that they're singing and the way they're drowning each other out, and it's all just pure rabble. And it's also good-natured. You do get that. It's very much good-natured, except that, as people do when they've had a huge amount to drink, like fights erupt. And that's what's happened here. But here we are in chapter 11, and there is still no story. We'll see what chapter 12 brings. Chapter 12 is about breakfast time. I guess there is a point to this. It's not a very dramatic chapter. Edward slept in because he's not used to the wine. When he comes down to the breakfast table, there's just Rose there. So this is the first conversation between Edward and Rose. Now, when I say I think she's a love interest, I have no reason to say that other than that she was described in such detail. And maybe she's not, because this certainly isn't any kind of romantic breakfast interlude. Now, even though Edward was raised by a Jacobite, Everard seems to have kept the more radical part of his political beliefs away from Edward. Edward is dwelling on the remarks that Bally made the night before being treasonous, and he feels that they were a personal slight to him, and he thinks that he can't let that sit. So he's very monosyllabic with Rose, who is trying to make conversation, and he's sort of thinking to himself that firstly, he needs to just leave that morning. He can't stay any longer. Secondly, he needs to get in touch with somebody from his regiment to meet him halfway back. And they need to go and see Bally and what? I have it out with him. I'm just wondering if he means actually have a proper duel with him in the king's honour, as it were. That seems to be what he's thinking. In which case he's completely forgotten all the advice of Everard, which is quite possible. It sort of is fitting, Edward being this hot-headed, idyllic youngster who doesn't really understand the real world. But it surprised me because I didn't see that in his nature up until now. I didn't think that he had become political enough to want to make a stand like that. To be honest, I'm surprised that he's brave enough to do something like that. He did seem like this dreamy little kid wandering the grounds of his house who wouldn't know what to do if a real issue hit him in the face. That's how he had come across. I'm also surprised that he's on good enough terms with his regiment that he thinks he can just send a message to somebody and they will come and join him for this. But there you have it. That is how he is and who he is. Right at the end of the meal, just when he's decided all this, he sees Tully, who is the Baron of Bradwardine, the man he came to see, Tully. He sees Tully walking outside with Bally, who was the guy that he presumed wasn't here, that he was going to go and have it out with. This surprises him hugely. Tully and Bally are walking outside deep in conversation, and after Edward has had breakfast, Tully calls him into another room so the three of them can talk. And it's kind of made clear that Bally doesn't want to be here. He's kind of subdued. And Tully goes into this big speech about how Bally had said the wrong thing and is aware that it was the wrong thing and asks Edward to forgive him. Edward does so in a very, very convoluted sentence. After which, Bally, who it turns out is slightly injured, leaves them, gets on his horse and goes home because apparently he's got stuff to handle there. And we're left with the impression that he didn't really want to make this apology at all and that Tully forced it on him. But Edward it seems, didn't pick that up. After that, it's just Tully and Edward and Rose, and they talk and finish eating. Tully comes back to the matter of the night before by saying, yep, Bally and Killy had had a heck of a lot to drink, but he had stayed relatively sober, and he noticed that Edward had too. This is not how Edward remembered it. He felt that Tully was actually probably the drunkest of them all, but he said nothing. And then they talk about David Gallatley, who was the mentally impaired man. They call him Davy. Apparently Davy loves music and artistic things. He's a creative free soul. A lot of the locals think that he's actually cleverer than he seems. They used to feel sorry for him when he was absolutely starving, but at some point he saved Rose's life in an event that we haven't had explained to us. Since then, the Baron has taken him into Bradwardine Manor and dressed him and is looking after him and feeding him, and the villagers no longer have so much sympathy for him. They think that he's onto a good thing and he figured it out, and that he's just pretending to be as impaired as he comes across. Rose does say that to an extent that's true. To an extent, if Davy doesn't want to have a conversation or doesn't want to do something, he seems to be much worse than he really is. If he's engaged in a task, if he wants to do something, he's quite capable of doing it. Of course, with our modern understanding of disabilities, we can see how that could be actually quite genuine, how if there is something that is a problem for him, he might not be able to bring his head to face it, and he might develop random behaviours rather than look a difficulty in the eye. In these days there's a bit of confusion over it, but Scott tells us that Davy really is somewhat impaired. I personally find it confronting that after Davy has saved Rose's life and they have taken him into the manor house and dressed him and fed him, that they've given him a jester costume. But jesters were an honourable profession once, and maybe that was his choice, I don't know. And we are talking 1805 when Scott was writing this, and 1745 when it's set, so he's doing all right. This was a time when people with disabilities very often just died quite young. So we get a bit more of Davy's story in this. He had a mother called Janet, and he had a brother. The brother was actually quite gifted and was sent off to some nearby university to get an education, but it all fell flat, and he came back. Seems to have had a breakdown. He was very musically gifted, but he came back and he died before he turned 19, which suggests to me that he had some of the same impairment that Davy has, just not quite in the same degree. The chapter ends with Edward and Bradwardine planning to go for a ride around the property and the horses being brought up. Chapter 13 crams a whole lot of stuff that I think could have gone in the last few. It's interesting to read. I quite enjoyed this chapter. Not that anything particular happened. They went for a ride around the property. Scott tells us that they got on really well. He doesn't exactly show that, and in going on to tell us how they got on really well, I don't really feel that he proved his point at all. Apparently the Baron is a very pragmatic, dry, factual man, whereas Edward, as we know, is a dreamy romantic. But the Baron has been going around this whole time spouting bits of French and Latin and mixing up intellectual speak with common day speak. And I think the idea is that he has bookish inclinations, but he hasn't really got the education behind it. So although he's sort of self-taught with a lot of classics and stuff, he does speak Latin, but it's kind of almost a pig Latin. He doesn't necessarily speak it correctly. He gets halfway into a Latin quote, can't get himself out of it, and finishes it in English. And not only in English, but in very blunt sort of English. To me, that makes him seem like a romantic. The fact that he's got these aspirations of being an educated man, an academic, and he's trying so hard to pull it off and just not quite managing it. And it's the same with the French. He sang that French song at Lucky McCleary's, and to me the fact that he didn't quite pull it off was more an indication that he didn't really understand what he was singing in the first place, because he didn't sort of explain it to the others. And they don't speak French, so it was completely meaningless to them. But he could have made that accessible for them if he was a truly educated man. So Scott tells us that the Baron is pointing to all the cottages and talking about who lives there and what their stories are and the whole place, and that their common ground is history. So when the Baron talks about all the places around in his dry factual way, Edward is finding this really interesting, because Edward, in his mind, is embellishing the dry facts with the story that goes with them, or the story that he imagines goes with them. The Baron is really happy to have an attentive audience, and therefore they're getting on like a house on fire. I'm not convinced, but let's just accept it. They're getting on really well. They like each other very much. They're enjoying this ride. And somewhere in this chapter we hear the story of Davy's mother, Janet. Janet was accused of being a witch. It was believed she was a witch because she had these two sons, one who was a musical genius and the other who was a half-wit. And that was deemed to be punishment for her witchery. So she was placed in some kind of local jail, but she refused to confess. She was kept without food or water for 6 days. By the 6th day she did confess. Apparently she was hallucinating a little bit and seeing the devil, and anyway she confessed. At that point some magisterial court was called with all the local lairds and dignitaries attending to ascertain was she really a witch. And during this process, which all the villagers came into as well, she had a hallucination and thought she saw the devil sitting among them, and she shrieked and pointed, and anyway she scared the hell out of them, and they all got up and fled the courtroom and ran off. Scott tells us that to prevent this story coming out anywhere, it would make them a laughing stock, especially the magistrates who were involved. They just deemed that she wasn't a witch, so that the matter was resolved and nobody said any other word about it, because even the villagers were kind of embarrassed by what they had done, the way they had just sort of fled the courtroom. So I don't know if we're told this because it's going to come up later, or if it's just a little local anecdote to help fill out the manners and customs of the Highlands. I suspect the latter. The other half of this chapter is back at Bradwardine Manor. They have dinner. The chaplain is there. The chaplain is named Mr. Rubrick. He was actually mentioned in an earlier chapter, but he didn't really play any part, and so many people were mentioned it didn't make sense to talk about them there. But Mr. Rubrick, the chaplain, is here having tea with them, and Edward is just sort of quietly listening to conversation between them, and they're telling him everything about their area because they know it really well and they're not used to having somebody interested who doesn't know. And then they go and visit Rose in her chamber. This kind of surprised me. It doesn't surprise me that the Baron would go and visit Rose. I mean, she's his daughter. He's just going to go and see his daughter. But this is a big rambling place, remember. And Rose has her own wing. So after lunch, or I think it's after lunch, Tully says, let's go visit Rose. And the three of them set off. Tully, the chaplain, and Edward. And that's what surprises me. It's okay for Tully to go and visit his daughter. Maybe it's okay for his chaplain to go and visit his daughter. But they're just taking Edward, who is a complete stranger to them, to a single girl's rooms. Rose lives in her own wing. It's a bit of a trek through the whole manor house to get there. And that has me wondering too. Fair enough, she's picked a fantastic spot. She lives in one of the towers. She's got the whole tower and the turrets and balustrade all to herself, and that is cool. Like, it's visually, that's a fantastic setting. It's not practical though. To get there, they had to climb a spiral staircase that sort of goes around the tower, around the wall of the tower, just round and round and round, all the way up. I admit I'd pick those rooms as well. They're magnificent. But given that she has to do this walk every day, down and back up, perhaps several times a day, gosh, you'd have a little place at the bottom, surely. It says, Mr. Bradwardine began to ascend by 2 steps at once, a very steep, narrow and winding stair. leaving Mr. Rubrick and Waverley to follow at more leisure, while he should announce their approach to his daughter, which is one good thing at least. She knows that strange men are coming to her apartments. After having climbed this perpendicular corkscrew until their brains were almost giddy, they arrived in a little matted lobby which served as an anteroom to Rose's sanctum sanctorum, and through which they entered her parlour. So she's got a small but pleasant parlour opening to the south, hung with tapestry. It's very medieval. Adorned with two pictures, one of her mother in the dress of a shepherd with a bell hoop, the other of the Baron in his 10th year. There's a bit of chat about those pictures. And then Rose joins them from her interior room, which thank goodness she has some space to go. So this is kind of like the lounge room in her apartments. Through a door, they can go along a little galley, that seems to be how it's described, and they come out on like a balcony around the turret. It's got an outer thing, and she's got a table and chairs set up. So they come outside onto this, and they're right at the top. This is right, like they can look down on some of the lower roofs of Bradwardine Manor. And she's looking over the garden, so she's looking to the back of the house where they've got all their formal gardens, and she's got views for miles. All of the terrain is described here, and it's a really cool setting. A projecting turret gave access to this Gothic balcony, which commanded a most beautiful prospect. The formal garden with its high bounding walls lay below, contracted as it seemed to a mere parterre, while the view extended beyond them down a wooded glen, where the small river was sometimes visible, sometimes hidden in copse. The eye might be delayed by a desire to rest on the rocks, which here and there rose from the dell with massive or spiry fronts, or it might dwell on the noble though ruined tower, which was here beheld in all its dignity, frowning upon a promontory over the river. To the left were seen 2 or 3 cottages, a part of the village. The brow of the hill concealed the others. The glen was terminated by a sheet of water called Loch Veolan, into which the brook discharged itself, and which now glistened in the western sun. The distant country seemed open and varied in surface, though not wooded, and there was nothing to interrupt the view until the scene was bounded by a ridge of distant and blue hills, which formed the southern boundary of the strath or valley. And then it says that Miss Bradwardine has ordered coffee. So that's another thing. Her servants have to carry hot drinks all the way up that spiral staircase around the tower to get to them. But it's fantastically picturesque. This 17-year-old golden-haired beautiful young girl with her own tower with this phenomenal view, and of course it's a sunny day. There's no mention of wind. Scott does do this very well. He has certainly set her character up well. Once the coffee comes, they're sort of just looking around and chatting about what they can see, and there is somewhere nearby the projecting peak of an impending crag that they're talking about. It has the name of St. Swithin's Chair. There's a song about St. Swithin's Chair, a very ancient song of which most of the words are lost, but Tully gets Rose to sing a little bit that they still know. She sings very beautifully, and then they discuss those words. That's pretty much all that happens in this chapter. It ends with them still sitting up here on the balcony. Scott drifts into poetry quite often in this, and I've just been skipping over that, but you have to read the poetry because it's not like just little extra bits. He actually uses the poetry as part of his narrative. So at this point he goes into this anecdote led to a long discussion of, and then there's a line of poetry about all those idle thoughts and fantasies, devices, dreams, opinions, unsound, etc. But anyway, they just talk. Local stories, prejudices, superstitions, such things. With such conversation and the romantic legends which it produced, closed our hero's second evening in the house of Tully Veolan. Which leaves me to think that they just sat up there in her rooms until very, very late, out on the balcony, in the dark, in the damp, and then made their way down that massive winding staircase in the dark with candles, maybe. I recently watched a YouTube video where somebody was exploring a castle, and I guess I've got that castle in mind because this one seems sort of similar. Like, this isn't exactly a castle, but it does have towers and turrets and rambling different parts of the building, and that just all seems very impractical to me, which doesn't mean it shouldn't be in there. I don't want to come across like I'm a totally pragmatic person. I love that sort of thing. It's just sometimes when it's so impractical that I don't see how it could work, it just leaves me asking the question, which this has. But fantastic place she's got there. I'd love it. That's all that happened in this chapter. We did see more of daily life in Bradwardine Manor, and I like that. Scott is presenting the extraordinary events kind of before he presents the ordinary ones, and many early writers do that because that's more fun, that's more exciting. You've spent time on your backstory and you don't really want to be putting that in. But for us, the reader, I'm looking at all these things that happen and I'm thinking, is this a daily event or is this an unusual event? Has Edward's visit triggered this, or did they do this anyway before he came? And we don't really know. And that is sort of interfering with me enjoying the story. I do understand this was written at the beginning of the 19th century, but I've read other stories written at the beginning of the 19th century and earlier, written in the 18th century, and didn't have quite this much trouble with them. I'm still liking it, and Scott really has a way of creating a scene. He's very visual. He's more visual than me, I think. Like his dining room with its massive ancient plate along the walls and the black oak wainscoting, and yeah, that is a fantastic setting. This Tower of Roses is a fantastic place. The views are wonderful. Once again, I'm seeing elements of Lord of the Rings in this, and I'm thinking yet again that Tolkien might have read this. The very fact that this is the House of the Bear, I just wonder if he used that in The Hobbit. Everything you see from Rose's balcony, all the terrain, the scenery is very much like a Tolkien description, and I like that too. The thing that I'm most having issue with is being told all this new stuff. Edward is constantly being placed somewhere new. We just started to get a feel for Waverley Honour and he left it. We had that chapter about his life in the military camp at Dundee, and then he left it, and now here he is in a new place, and that just means that Scott is constantly having to describe what's around him to us, and we're never actually getting down to just like living a day and seeing what these people are thinking and feeling. Like, we get a bit of that, but here's Edward on the outside again, just sitting there while he's watching other people talk to each other, and he's just sort of feeling his way. I'm sick of that. I'm sick of every time he goes into a room, he's never been in that room before, so the whole room gets described to you. And every time he comes face to face with somebody, it's somebody he's never seen before, so their description gets given to us. I feel like by the time we get to the end of chapter 13, we should, as the reader, be on familiar ground. We should just be starting to be in his head and getting into some kind of narrative here. We shouldn't still be feeling like a tourist. So I'm hoping very much that changes. I'm hoping that we don't just get another new person next chapter and then Edward leaves here and goes somewhere else and it all begins again. I'm going to feel like quitting the book if that keeps happening. It's just such a waste of paper to be constantly describing things. That said, Scott's first book, he was feeling his way. There's obviously a lot ahead, so I'll push through a little bit further, but I'll be very glad when this comes to an end. I am also wondering yet again how he can be here, how he, as a new soldier in his regiment, as a captain, which means he's got troops under him, he has duties, surely, how he can just trip off and come up here into the heart of Jacobite territory, which is what he's done, which is something else that I actually kind of like. Richard's ministry got him this position to prevent him from finding Jacobite companions on the continent. So they've sent him here to Scotland and he's right here in the heart of it. And that's a cool piece of irony, I think. I can sort of see the beginnings of Scott being a good author. I feel like there's a lot of material here, a lot of great settings. I almost imagine that if you turned this into, say, a modern day movie and like cut the crud out, you've got something rather cool happening. It's beautifully gothic. It's beautifully alien. There is a sense of open spaces and strange places and people living in a sort of a mystical, legendary way. And I do like all that. If only he could just cut the rubbish and get on with the story. And that's the end of the chapter.